Winter Orb, Static Orb, and Torpor Orb. Aside from their ball-like form factor, these cards belong to a broad subset of cards that stop players from doing things. Whether it's Trinosphere or Damping Sphere, or even these contentious depictions of spheres, Magic the Gathering has a long history of printing cards that say, "Don't play the game." They brutalize the mana base, hinder spellcasting, and block vital game actions. In many cases, they hurt not only opponents, but the caster as well. And due to their ability to grind games to a halt, Stax cards are universally hated. And yet, many of us still find ourselves drawn to them. I myself am a ball enthusiast, or in other words, a longtime Stax player in Magic the Gathering. I've seen the pitfalls taken by new and veteran players alike, and I'm quite opinionated about the subject. So let's talk about Stax. What is it? Why do we play it? Is Stax right for you? Does it make you an asshole? And is it actually effective or just a meme? This video is a discussion about Magic's most controversial archetype in the Commander format. We've got a lot to talk about, so let's begin. Chapter 1. What is Stax? You'll get many different answers for where the name comes from, but as I hinted in the intro, Stax broadly refers to a strategy that has the overarching theme of resource denial. A Stax card belongs to a category of cards that limits the number of possible game actions a player can make, sometimes through blocking card draw, restricting mana production, or simply saying you can't do that. I found this great link on Moxfield to a categorized list of 400 and something Stax cards. I'll leave the link down below if you're interested. Among these cards, you'll find ones that make spells and abilities more expensive or otherwise neutralize their effects. For every game element, there's an equal and opposite Stax piece, whether it's as broad as attacking or gaining life, or as narrow as casting a spell with the same name as something in play, or playing a non-token permanent originally printed in the Antiquities expansion. Each Stax card addresses a unique part of the game, and in essence is one that does nothing, like in the quippy flavor text of Nullrod. Another way to look at this is as follows. In the most reductive sense, the resources in Magic are mana and cards. Players use these resources in order to progress their game plan, and Stax effects are ones that invalidate these transactions. Depending on how restrictive these effects are, it's sometimes helpful to further define two categories of Stax cards. Soft Stax effects are those that disadvantage players by forcing them to choose between game actions, slow them down but don't otherwise stop them from making those actions. Tax effects are good examples of this. The most distilled form is Sphere of Resistance, which simply makes every spell cost one more to cast, but Stax's Poster Girl Thalia is also a form of soft Stax. Alternatively, an effect like Blind Obedience, Root Maze, or Arkelos' first ability can lower the efficiency of turns by making permanents enter tapped. All of these cards can be very impactful, especially in the early game, but like the name Soft Stax suggests, these effects never stop a card from being played eventually. Given enough time, and therefore mana, players can simply push through any imposed tax. On the other hand, hard Stax effects put a hard restriction to any number of things, imposing rules that outright forbid searching the library, enter effects, death triggers, or infamously casting spells from anywhere other than your hand. Contrasted to a soft Stax effect that can be overcome with time, a hard Stax effect necessitates removal in order to get around its effect, and generally can be relevant at any point in the game. If you're enjoying this content, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to my channel. I'm still getting started and it would help out so much. So what makes a Stax deck? While it might be simple to say that a Stax deck is just one that runs a lot of Stax cards, this is only the surface. In reality, Stax is an extremely deliberate archetype, and a good Stax deck isn't one that just jams all the Stax pieces it can. Many Stax pieces are narrow by nature, some worse than others, and we won't get far if we don't define an overall game plan. One word that you'll hear over and over in discussions about Stax is parity. When we evaluate common Stax pieces like Rule of Law, Collector Oof, Cursed Totem, or Torpor Orb, one common thread is that they're all completely symmetrical. Parity is a state of equality, and it alludes to the fact that in a vacuum, all players at the table are equally disadvantaged by these Stax effects. Yet, if Stax is the strategy of resource denial, then the Stax deck is one that aims to leverage this to get ahead on resources. And this process is called breaking parity. The easiest way to achieve this is simply running asymmetrical Stax pieces that impose one-sided rules like Drannith Magistrate, Linvala, or Karn the Great Creator. After that, a Stax deck relies on careful deck building to succeed. Running Torpor Orb or Containment Priest in a deck full of blink effects is foolish at best. And likewise, if we know we're running effects like Collector Oof, it would be a huge mistake to include 10 mana rocks in our list. In this case, almost every deck runs mana rocks, so if we somehow build our deck without them, we break parity through exclusion. Rule of Law and its spin-offs are notorious Stax effects that are extremely effective in stopping combo plays. We could devote an entire video to all the play patterns that Rule of Law counteracts, but for the sake of the current discussion, let's break parity on this effect that reads, each player can't cast more than one spell each turn. Rule of Law only prevents casting spells, so it won't affect cards like Eladamri, Birthing Pod, or Kona Rescue Beastie that just put threats onto the battlefield without casting. Alternatively, flash effects like Valley Floodcaller, High Fae Trickster, or Vivian Champion of the Wilds let us reach the one spell quota on our opponent's turns, so these effects get around the law using loopholes. And then finally, one edge case involves Stax pieces that have on-off switches. Certain cards like these balls, 3-Ball, Winter Ball, and Static Ball, can be turned off conditionally if they're tapped. You'll find them more often in decks that can twiddle them to be off on your turn and on your opponent's turns, like Urza, Miria, or Derevi. So from this, we can finally answer the question of what makes a Stax deck. The answer is the combination of Stax pieces and ways to break parity on them. We'll go over my evaluations on some of these specific decks at the end of the video, but it's easy then to see why certain commanders lend themselves nicely to Stax. Prison decks like Grand Arbiter break parity on mana through his asymmetrical tax effect, and Sithis can do the same through the omission of mana rocks while running heavy artifact hate. Some aggressive commanders like Elavir or Winota do very well running early, low-to-the-ground hate pieces as a good way to stifle counterplay until they snowball into the win. But of course, these are just a few examples, and we'll find that Stax players can get a little deranged with their deck ideas. Chapter 2. Should you play Stax? Understanding the inner workings of the Stax philosophy should make it obvious why Stax is the most hated archetype. It takes a normal game of Magic and turns it on its head, with the goal of making the game unfair. Soft Stax effects derail a deck's design curve, while the rest of the deck aims to make your cards useless. And in this way, Stax emulates not only Mana Screw, but the feeling of helplessness similar to when you top deck mana sources while flooded. So to answer the question, should you play Stax, we have to consider the reasons why we subject our opponents to this torment. I am a self-proclaimed ball enthusiast. For over a decade, I've been a Stax enjoyer, and like others, I've learned a lot about the pitfalls and mistakes of piloting the archetype. One particular thing I've learned is this: although Stax has a reputation of being sweaty and competitive, it is far from strong, and I will make the case that it is the weakest archetype for a number of reasons. This is a huge point of contention, and the reason why I made this video is because I tend to have this exact conversation at least once or twice a month, especially with less experienced players. The short answer and cruel reality is that many players play Stax for the, quote, wrong reasons, and most players shouldn't be playing Stax at all. Consider this: if taxes and restrictions say don't play the game, what's the point of playing them at all? EDH is first and foremost a game, and Stax effects undermine the social understanding that everyone will get together and have fun playing said game. A Stax lockdown quickly devolves into solitaire, accompanied by the sounds of distant groans and the occasional table flip. To understand this question, let's talk about the psychology of Stax. Am I qualified to psychoanalyze my fellow rectangle enjoyers? No, but I'll do it anyway. In my experience, there are three main psychographic profiles that explain why we play Stax. First is Brody. Brody and his friends have been playing EDH for a few months. They started with precons and slowly upgraded them. At first, everything was fine and peaceful, until Big Bad Brad discovered the power of credit fraud. One thing leads to another, but the straw that breaks the camel's back is the introduction of A+B combos. Justifiably, Brody is frustrated that he can no longer play the game he signed up for. With a calm but wrathful deliberation, he decides, if I can't play the game, no one else can. Brody is our first profile, the sore loser. In a less extreme scenario, this is the type of player who can't handle when decks do the thing. He hasn't yet come to terms that it's okay that decks have weaknesses and wants to be able to board an answer for everything. And the best security to make sure his opponents aren't making unfair plays is to make sure they can't make those plays in the first place. Next we have Kyle. Kyle is a quirky gamer. His favorite things are Floral Spasm, Shahrazad, and telling people about his newfound knowledge of layers. He enjoys stretching complicated interactions to their limit, and the most complicated of them all is social interaction. Wouldn't it be so funny if I made 400 copies of Sphere of Resistance? Or get this, if I turned off everyone's artifacts, creatures, non-creature spells, and gave everything I control hexproof and indestructible? Kyle is the giggler. He finds great joy in sitting back and chuckling to himself at the thought of wasting everyone's time. His decks almost never have a dedicated win con because they're filled to the brim with highly specific, low-value Stax pieces that can't close out a game on their own. In reality, no one wants to play with Kyle, and it's not entirely clear whether Kyle wants to actually play Magic at all. If you haven't gotten it yet, Brody and Kyle are exaggerations, but also reflections of myself in the past, and what I see in a lot of players following the same path. Time and time again, I see the same remarks like, I'm gonna build this deck to teach my friends a lesson. And I won't say that this mentality is incorrect, but the habit of creating decks just to mess with your opponents is a treacherous one, and leads to sloppier decks overall. In my opinion, these are the two worst ways to approach decks, because they create locks without purpose, leading to stalemates rather than decisive victories. Commander is a PvP format, and in any case, all players should be aiming to win the game. If players can't do that, the consolation prize is being able to do something cool or unexpected with their commander. That's why nothing is worse than a deck designed neither to win nor permit cool plays. So getting back to the question of should you play Stax? If you catch yourself drifting towards these profiles, it's probably time to reconsider. Otherwise, you might belong to a third player model, the responsible gamer who enjoys Stax because it's a necessary evil and one that generates healthy table interactions. A responsible Stax player is one who plays Stax both purposefully and appropriately. Let's break this down. Playing Stax purposefully means that rather than assembling a lock for the sake of it, it's important that each Stax piece fits a specific role. For example, an aggro deck needs only to cross the finish line before its opponents, so playing soft Stax pieces that tax or tap is all you need to ensure that your threats develop faster and are protected in the short term, while cards like Boromir, Gadok Teeg, Raydane, or Aven Interrupter can protect you from an errant board wipe. These Stax pieces directly correlate with the deck's game plan, and each disrupts a specific weakness of the strategy. By contrast, a disruptive combo deck might see these pieces differently, or run a completely different package altogether. A less deliberate deck builder might enjoy Grand Arbiter, and indeed 57% of Grand Arbiter Stax builds run Archon of Emeria, a card that only hurts a deck built around discounted spells, and lessens the impact of taxes because opponents can only play one spell a turn. 16% of Arbiter decks run Trinisphere even though its effect is applied after taxes, and once this deck applies a soft lock, where does it go from here? This screams as a red flag of running too many Stax pieces at the opportunity cost of proper threats. Playing Stax appropriately means knowing the time and place to bust out the Stax. On the surface, it's easy to understand why people don't enjoy playing against Stax. Resource denial removes player agency, and although the theory is that Stax pieces affect the whole table, they never play out that way. Curse Totem will disproportionately disrupt the mana Dork player, and Null Rod will discombobulate the mana Rock player. To the affected players, it may feel like you're targeting them, and that's not the best place to be socially. At the same time, I shouldn't have to tell anyone that Drannith Magistrate is not an okay card to play at an ultra-casual table. But that also doesn't mean that Stax is CDH only. Take it this way, if your entire deck is dismantled by a single collector oof, that's emblematic of a deck building flaw, and admittedly this is a healthy form of frustration. But if the pre-game discussion dictates that you're gonna have a chill friendly game, don't be an asshole. Winter Orb and Static Orb are the same functionally as Mass Land Destruction, therefore they're only appropriate where Armageddon is as well. And especially in the case of Mass Land Destruction, it's really only acceptable when victory is all but assured. When we compare different Stax win cons, getting beat down by a Jetmir Stax deck sure feels overwhelming, but it's a difficult task to get to 9 creatures and relies on combat. By contrast, a lock like Living Plain Elish Norn will leave the table with no lands, and Elish Norn's controller with an army of 4/4s. This is a game-ending situation and is no different than any other A+B combo, like Kiki Jiki Pestermite or some Blink Loop. While there's a level of whimsy to say you won with Uba Mask, the end result is the same as taking infinite turns. If your table isn't okay with these win cons, it's not a good idea to emulate them. All this to say, run win cons in your Stax deck, but read the room. Chapter 3. How do you play Stax? Let's talk about how Stax stacks up. As I've mentioned before, Stax is a difficult deck to construct, and in my opinion, it's the weakest archetype in Commander. The more I think about Stax as an archetype, the more and more flaws I come up with. So here are just some of the reasons why Stax is bad. 1. There's an inherent weakness of poor card selection and card advantage. The vast majority of Stax pieces are very effective at addressing one specific thing, but notably never generate card advantage on their own or even replace themselves. Some even actively hurt your ability to do so. In a 100 card format, this creates a large deck building strain. If your deck really cares about rule of law effects, how many will you run? Drawing one lets you initiate the Stax plan, and a second one is necessary to layer that same effect so you don't fall to a removal spell. But the more and more iterations of the same effect we draw, the less impactful each one becomes. Then, when we introduce other types of Stax effects and their redundant copies, we end up with a bloated, ineffective deck. Another way to look at this is by examining the effects of Hate Bears. Hate Bear is the universally accepted term for a little 2 or 3 mana Stax critter, because they have a similar mana cost and stat line as Grizzly Bears, but are just a little less fun at parties. The upside to Hate Bears is their cheap cost and ability to create a layered lock, by flooding the board with more and more restrictions. The problem with Hate Bears is that although they go wide, they can't do so aggressively. Their small stat lines mean they don't pack much of a punch, and the second something bigger comes along, they're useless as blockers because you'll often value the Stax effect more than the block. In essence, with the turns and mana devoted in creating the best layered Stax lock, you could have developed a threat, escalated it, and won the game instead. 2. Stax is entirely meta dependent. The lifeblood of Stax is proactively handling issues before they arise. Therefore, in order to effectively target those issues, you have to know the types of decks you'll encounter. In this way, you might have heard Stax be described as anti-meta. Let's take Root Maze as an example. Root Maze has an effect that makes artifacts and lands enter tapped. This is quite a perplexing effect for decks that rely on artifact ramp, but in general only goes so far since it doesn't stop players from making land drops every turn and untapping the following turn. One situation where this card shines is against fetch lands. With Root Maze, if a player drops a fetch land, they won't be able to crack it right away, and when they do the following turn, they won't have the option to grab an untapped duel or shock. On the other end of the spectrum, Root Maze does practically nothing against a mana base filled with gates and other tap duels. This situational scaling of Stax pieces is what makes Stax so meta dependent. Rule of Law, very good against combo and highly impactful against the EDH fast mana suite, but against opponents running dragons and 9 mana sorceries, actively griefing. Knowing your meta is a game of probability, of knowing how likely you are to see a certain card, how badly you want to disrupt it, and at what density. Another case study, before Dockside Extortionist got banned, it wasn't unreasonable for a EDH deck to run layer upon layer of hate for Dockside Extortionist because it was so prevalent in the meta. After the ban, the goblin-shaped power vacuum that remained created a blind meta where all sorts of decks can delight. I'll leave links down below to Comedian MTG and EDH TV that explain the situation better than I can. You should watch these even if you aren't interested in EDH. But the gist is that Stax is terrible in a blind pod. Not knowing which Stax pieces are important means we're running useless cards, and only compounds our previous issue with card selection. 3. Stax doesn't really work in a multiplayer format. In a vacuum, Stax is the ultimate counter to combo decks. Yet, how is it that combo decks somehow always slip under the radar and steal the win? The answer lies in the fact that Stax is proactive interaction and therefore is very visible. It's not difficult to imagine a situation where your Stax piece is negatively impacting both Jessica and David. David is playing a deck heavy in artifact ramp and your Null Rod is stopping him from developing his board. When it comes to his turn, he top decks Nature's Claim and lets out a sigh of relief. Removing your Null Rod allows him to finally drop his big threat. Passing to Jessica, she plays Isochron Scepter, imprinting Dramatic Reversal, a very popular infinite combo. It turns out, while your very visible Stax piece was busy painting a target on itself, the invisible threat was there all along. All Jessica had to do was wait for the window, especially knowing that David had spent his artifact removal breaking the lock, and now had no response to her Isochron Scepter. On paper, Stax is the worst nightmare of combo decks, but this logic breaks down once we consider the multiplayer format. Playing Rule of Law may stop a Thassa Consultation player, but doesn't stop Birthing Pod combo, a slower combo that benefits from your Stax piece. These examples of king-making create advantageous situations for opponents by neutralizing certain threats, but not others. 4. The psychological impact of Stax steers games. Veteran Stax players should be no stranger to playing Arch Enemy. When it's a Stax player that's presenting cards that are actively hindering other players, it's easy to become the straw man of the table. It's so common to see players get so mildly annoyed by an early hate bear that they spend precious removal on it, only to face down an even bigger threat in a few turns. You ask, was it worth removing my creature? And they respond, well, you're playing Stax, so I'd rather them win than you. And fair, I guess, even despite the aforementioned weaknesses of the archetype. Their answer isn't really satisfying for you, and just like that, you're not having fun either. In the end, there's not much you can do about poor threat assessment or spite plays, and we'll just chalk this one up to an unsolvable enigma of a social format. So how do we get around these issues? My intention for this video isn't only to slander Stax. As I've mentioned, Stax is one of my favorite strategies, and if it were completely unplayable, I wouldn't be playing it. There's something compelling about winning with a deck that has a lot of things going against it, so here are my ground rules for playing Stax. Firstly, pick a commander that can both apply pressure and mitigate poor card quality. Rather than a commander that seems Staxy, build around something with a built-in win con or engine. Commanders that are Stax pieces aren't good at all. This includes Grand Arbiter, Gadok Teeg, Dronalyn Vala, and Kudo. All of these commanders might be annoying to see, Grand Arbiter somehow being the rank 1 Stax commander on EDH rec, but they'll all struggle to close out a game. None of them are particularly threatening, nor can they help us find threats. Leave these in the 99. Even as a self-proclaimed #1 Yasharn fanboy, I will concede that Yasharn is not a very good commander. I made a video about the broad sweeping impact of his Stax effect, but unfortunately it's neither fast nor targeted enough to warrant the commander slot. Instead of these, keep the pressure going with commanders that naturally escalate as you slow the game down. And if your commander doesn't have built-in card advantage, make sure to include it liberally in the 99. Aggressive commanders are some of my favorites because they 1. Fulfill the fantasy of playing tons of these little hate bear critters, and 2. Impose pressure to close out games before players can get around our Stax pieces. Jetmir is cool, and you'll find lists that run upwards of 60 or more creatures, and although I have spoken ill of hate bears in this video, it becomes a different story once they're all 5 power double striking tramplers. This is the epitome of upscaling, and we can see a similar game plan in Winota. Although Boros has many issues and Winota is largely a one-trick pony, her ability to snowball games to a close is widely feared for a reason. For value-oriented commanders, Elevir also gets around the weaknesses of the Stax strategy. Her effects are fair and easy to underestimate, but they will close out a game if unchecked. Virtuous Roll tokens upgrade our small utility creatures and mana dorks into threats, their Stax effects protect this board, and her second ability keeps us stocked with cards. Second, only run good Stax pieces and stop trying to force bad ones. As I've mentioned before, an effective Stax deck only has room for the disruption it needs to function. Running an overly wide Stax package is a sign your deck is unfocused, and running overly narrow Stax effects only limits your own deck building without meaningfully impacting the game. Here's a problem with Torpor Orb. If I were to ask what problem Torpor Orb solves, it's hard to give an answer because enter effects do all sorts of things. Given a limited amount of deck space, it's a bad idea to prioritize effects that have unknown outcomes, and thus these effects are first on the chopping block. On the other hand, almost every deck is affected by Drannith Magistrate, and every deck casts spells. Mana Rocks and Tutors fill the same role every game, so Stax pieces that affect them are less likely to be dead draws. But for narrower effects, we really have to justify their inclusion. For example, while I might not recommend Torpor Orb itself, cards like Hushwing Gryff and Doorkeeper Thrall are at least evasive attackers, and we might forgive these in a deck that needs more creatures. Thirdly, cultivate your metagame knowledge and play around it. Since Stax is designed to disrupt, we shouldn't regard the Stax game plan as linear. Instead, our play should be informed by the actions of our opponents. At the same time, Stax pieces are most impactful in the early game, before players set up engines or accumulate ways to get around them. In both cases, it's a race against time, so our play pattern can change and should before the game even begins. When we shuffle up and play, the opposing commander choices are public knowledge. Even in blind pods, we should have some idea of what to expect. Predict your opponent's moves before the game starts, understand the potential their decks have, and mulligan aggressively to find the most applicable Stax piece if necessary. 4. Maintain board awareness and layer your Stax effects carefully. Stax pieces are removal magnets, so having multiple of the same effect on board is often beneficial. But it can also be good to hold off on playing certain effects until you have more game knowledge. For example, it may turn out that you need to enlist the help of an opponent to deal with a common threat, and they may be unable or otherwise unwilling to do so under a Stax effect. When we're behind, it's important not to bait ourselves into playing every Stax piece we draw, for fear of helping a player who's ahead keep that lead. The fate of a game can drastically change with the addition or removal of even single Stax pieces, so it's important we weigh the pros and cons of every play we make. And finally, train your charisma. The best part about Stax is when it becomes a puzzle. Use politics to make a case for why someone shouldn't remove your Stax piece, and be vocal about the role you're playing in preventing bigger problems. Evaluate the game state frequently, keep the table updated so they know where the real threats are, and announce the repercussions of disassembling your lock. This is the most important skill to develop as a Stax player. When we're playing cards bound to infuriate, we need to bring our opponents back to their senses with reason and threat assessment. It's how we keep games from turning into 3-on-1s, or having players accidentally throw to the small bean combo player. If you have any more pointers on how to play Stax effectively, make sure you leave a comment too. I'd love to hear what I missed. Stax has a perception of being a competitive strategy, but it can only be as competitive as the table lets it be. That is, Stax only really shines in solve metas with defined game plans. It's a paradoxically strong strategy, but a weak archetype. It's not beginner-friendly by virtue of the vast game knowledge you need to pilot it effectively, and can even prove difficult for veterans to pilot if the table isn't receptive to politics. If you take away one message, it's that Stax is a parasitic archetype, and is often misconstrued as overly powerful. Its strengths lie entirely in metagaming, and it can't win on its own without integrating some other strategy. In other words, it's most prevalent in CDH because Stax addresses competitive playlines, not because Stax itself is particularly competitive. Stax will always be one of my favorite strategies because it scratches this itch to want to have an answer to every situation, and provides an effective check to explosive decks. It opens up avenues to weaker strategies, whether it be combat, slower combos, or rare interactions you have trouble fitting in elsewhere. And because of its proactive nature, it can lead to interesting board states and political situations. In the future, maybe I'll deck tech my favorite Stax deck and how I've scaled it to be fair for all sorts of power levels. But for now, let me know your thoughts, what you think about Stax, or any of the points I made in this video. Let me know if you'd like to hear more about a different archetype. And as always, it would mean the world if you took the time to click the like button and subscribe to my channel. Thanks to all my patrons who made this work possible. I'll see you guys next time.